I want to start on a somber note. I do hope it'll be a liberating reflection afterwards. My sense is, this is hard to say, but my sense is that really this is our moment as to whether or not we're going to make it. I think it's possible we are in the shadow of our own extinction on this planet. Hard to say, it sounds melodramatic, it always seems to me over the top when I utter it. And I'm mindful that throughout history there's been so many apocalyptic visions of doom, and thank God they've all turned out to be dead wrong. But I'm going to share a statistic with you this afternoon. Mull it over and you come to your own conclusions. I teach at the Wharton School. It's the oldest business school in the world, and I teach in the advanced management program. We bring in CEOs, senior executives from all over the world for 5 weeks of intensive re-education. When they sit down, I tell them they have to understand what the primary economy of the earth is, because our MBAs are never taught what the primary economy is. The primary economy of the earth is photosynthesis. That's the bottom line. Now, we human beings, we are the youngest species in the evolutionary neighborhood. We are the babies on the block. Anatomically modern human beings have been here only 175,000 years. We make up only 1/2% of the entire living biomass of the earth, 1/2%. Right now, this afternoon, we are using 24% of all the photosynthesis of the earth. And we're heading from 6.8 to nearly 10 billion people. We're monsters. We're devouring this earth, and it's probably going to lead to our extinction unless we turn this around quickly. This is just not sustainable by any reckoning. We've had 2 events in the last 2 years which I believe signals the end game for the great industrial age based on fossil fuels. July 2008, go back to that month and recall what happened. Oil hit $147 a barrel on world markets. Prices went through the roof. Food riots in 30 countries. Basic staples like rice, wheat, barley were unaffordable for the poor, because everything is embedded in fossil fuels. We grow our food primarily in petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. All of our construction materials, from cement to plastic, are embedded in fossil fuels. Virtually all of our pharmaceutical products are still petrochemical based. Most of our fiber is synthetic. Our power, transport, heat, and light, all based on fossil fuels. We have created one of the great short-lived civilizations in history, and we did it by digging up the burial grounds of the Jurassic Age. We exhumed those carbon deposits, and this is the result. I try to imagine what future generations will think of us if we do survive. And I try to go up 150, 200,000 years from now and imagine when they look back at this time, none of this will be here. The pyramids will be gone. The skyscrapers will be gone. And the only record they will ever have that we were here is our CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide footprint deep in the geological record. And they'll say, oh yeah, way back then, they were the oil people. We had the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. They lived off fossil fuel deposits, short-lived civilization. When oil hit $147 a barrel, purchasing power plummeted across the world in July 2008, and the entire economic engine of this industrial revolution, it shut down. That was the earthquake. The collapse of the financial market 60 days later was the aftershock. My colleagues are still dealing with the aftershock because they don't want to have to acknowledge that if they go to the earthquake, we'd have to rethink all of civilization. We have hit peak globalization. We now know the outer limit of how far we can globalize based on fossil fuels. It's 147 a barrel, then we hit the wall. The reason we've hit peak globalization is because of something called peak oil per capita. Do not confuse it with global peak oil production. They are 2 different things. Global peak oil production, a geological term. It's when half the oil reserves are used up on the classic Hubert bell curve in geology. When half the oil reserves are used up, it's over because we cannot afford the price on the other side of that curve. There's controversy about global peak oil, but it's narrowing. In 2000, 2001, the International Energy Agency, who are always the optimists, they projected that at a 3.5% growth rate in consumption, this was before China and India made their bid to be part of the Industrial Revolution, that we'd peak around 2035. In the last 10 years, however, some of the great geologists in the world, using new computer simulation studies, new oil and gas figures, and they've even factored in dramatic new oil discoveries we don't know about yet, and 90% efficiency in getting the remaining oil and gas out, which is damn optimistic. Their studies show we peak somewhere between 2010 and 2020. One of the world's leading geologists said we peaked last year. The North Sea peaked a few years ago. Mexico's peaking right around now. Russia doesn't have much further to go before it peaks. Even the IEA has come out with a new forecast saying supply crunch 2014. I don't know who's right here. It makes no difference between the pessimists and the optimists at this point. They're now arguing about 10, 15, 20 years. That is such a small window to rethink the entire energy regime, the whole infrastructure of civilization. It takes my breath away. But the reason we hit peak globalization at 147 a barrel is peak oil per capita. No controversy here. It happened in 1979 at the height of the auto age. BP did the study. Others have confirmed the study over and over. If we were to distribute all the oil reserves that were on this planet in 1979 to everyone alive at that moment, that's the most each person could have. We found more oil since then. Population rose quicker. So if we distributed all the oil we have now to 6.8 billion people, there's simply less to go around. So you see where I'm heading. When China and India made a bid to bring 1/3 of the human race in at a 10% growth rate to the second industrial revolution, the demand pressure against the oil and gas reserves and all the other energies shadow them, it was too great. And at 147 a barrel, the engine shut down. Right now, we're trying to regrow the economy by replenishing inventories. It's very tepid growth, but what's happening? Oil's going over 70 a barrel again as demand picks up. What I'm suggesting to you is every time we try to pick up the demand at the pace we were before, the prices of oil will go up, the engine will shut down, and we will collapse. This is an end game. And the next time this happens, there's going to be panic, because then we will have to move from denial to acknowledgement that this is it. This is it. The second event, let me take you to December 2009. 194 government heads of state show up in Copenhagen to deal with the entropy bill for the industrial age. Where are my engineers and chemists here? Where are you? As you know, you cannot escape the second law of thermodynamics. This is not a metaphor. We put in so much CO2, spent energy into the atmosphere, that we're not getting enough of the sun's heat off this planet. It's as simple as that. How bad is it? It's much worse than we're being told. In 2007, the Intergovernmental UN Panel on Climate Change issued its long-awaited fourth assessment report. I was in Paris at that time. President Chirac asked me to come in when this was published to address where do we go from here. And what stunned me about the report, and I must say, we were waiting for years. This is 2,500 scientists across 120 countries, 20 years of modeling, the biggest scientific project in history across disciplines, and I was stunned, and so were my colleagues, because frankly, we got it wrong. Where's Bill Borger here, who had my book, Entropy? You remember in 1980, that was, in the book you have with you, that was the first time we mentioned climate change, or in a popular book, but we didn't know at the time. We didn't have the studies in. And we continued to underestimate the speed and acceleration of climate change, all of us, for 30 years, because we can't anticipate all the feedback loops. That's what's terrifying us now. For example, the third assessment report of the UN, done in 2001, said that the great glaciers on our mountain ranges might begin to disappear in the early 22nd century. The fourth report, 2007, we're getting the real glacier melt now. we're losing a lot of the glaciers in the first 50 years of this century, 100 years before we thought. This isn't about skiing in Davos. 1 out of every 6 human beings on this planet lives down from those glaciers in valleys and relies on that melt for sanitation, irrigation, water, everything. So how do we repopulate 1/6 of the population of the world in 50 years or less? And that's just the beginning. Our scientists in the 3rd report said, look to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. By the 22nd century, the water will be heated up. We will see more Category 3, Category 4, and 5 hurricanes. The 4th report, 2007, Rita, Katrina, Ike, and Gustav, we are in real-time climate change. It's here. We've doubled the intensity of hurricanes in 30 years. And I'm reminded that this is not academic. If you live on the coast, anywhere from Maine all the way down to Houston, the first day of hurricane season, you've got that Weather Channel on every morning. Is there another one coming? Is this it? And we cannot get insurance for coastal property across the coast. We're here. The Arctic early warning signs. The 3rd report said we may see open waters in the Arctic in the summer by the 22nd century. The 4th report, we've had open waters for 4 years. You can kayak into the Arctic in August. And for those skeptics who say this is just a momentary seasonal adjustment, please. The Arctic has been encased in ice for millions and millions of years. This is the first time we're seeing open waters. And this is only 2010. So our scientists say that we may see a 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature on Earth in this century. It could go much higher. That's a middle negotiated scenario. But to put this in perspective, if we only go up 3 degrees, it takes us back to the temperature on Earth 3 million years ago in the Pliocene. Different flora, different fauna, different ecosystems. And here's the key that I wish Al Gore and others had talked about in their public campaigns. It is all about water. This is really all about the water, the hydrological cycle. And that is, for every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature rises on this planet, the atmosphere absorbs 7% more precipitation from the ground. That's the key. That means the whole water cycle shifts. More floods, more droughts, more periods of infrequent rain. And so ecosystems that were developed over eons of time cannot adjust to this disruptive change in the hydrological cycle. If we go 2 to 3 degrees, which is looking awfully optimistic, our scientists say we could lose between 23–24% of all the assessed species on Earth by the end of this century, your kid's lifetime. And on the upper end, 70% or more extinction in the lifetime of babies who are here now. We need to be clear about what this means. We have had 5 waves of biological extinction on Earth in the last 450 million years in the geological record. Every time we had a mass wipeout, it took 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost. As my wife says, we're not grasping the enormity of this moment. We are sleepwalking and in denial. We may see it academically. Many of us are committed emotionally, but we still don't have ourselves in an emergency mode. We don't really, in our heart, believe that this could be a decisive moment for the continuation of our species and our fellow species on this planet. It is about feedback loops. In the 3rd report, the scientists mentioned the permafrost in Siberia, which is an area the size of France and Germany, and there's permafrost on the ground, but they didn't have any results in on the studies. Well, now the results are in. You see, underneath that permafrost is a ticking time bomb. All the carbon deposits of the pre-ice age are under that ground, because Siberia was a teeming grassland full of animal and plant life, and when the temperature shifts on Earth, it shifts quickly. The shift from the last ice age to today took place in 10 years during the Younger Dryas period. A third of the temperature change, wipeout. So when it happened in Siberia, all the animal and plant life was trapped under the ground. The permafrost is keeping it in a tomb. The frost is melting. And it was published in the journal Nature about 1.5 years ago. And now a new report just recently says the frost is melting 6 times faster than we thought 12 months ago. And underneath there is more carbon than in all the rainforests in the world, and methane coming up as well. And that's just one area of the world. If that all goes, that frost goes, I don't know what to say to us. And that's just one feedback loop. So I advised the European Union. We were going to Copenhagen, hoping to talk the world into mitigating CO2 at 450 parts per million by 2050, with the idea that we might go up 2 degrees and hold. That would be devastating. It may not work, but at least we could keep it to 2. Then James Hansen threw us a curve. Now, he's the chief climatologist for the United States government. He's the head of the NASA Goddard Space Institute. His team went under the ocean. They looked at geological core samples, and they said to Brussels, you've got it wrong. If you mitigated 450 parts per million CO2, remember, we've never even seen 350 parts until now. The temperature on Earth doesn't go up 2 degrees. And I want every parent in the room to hear what I'm saying. If we mitigated 450 parts per million, the temperature goes up 6 degrees Celsius in this century, and this is a paraphrase, the end of human civilization as we've come to know and adapt to it. That's the chief climatologist for the United States government. I hope he's wrong. I hope they're all wrong. I hope we wake up and this is a Y2K nightmare, but I don't think it is. Peak oil, peak globalization, accelerating climate change. What do we do? What do we do? What we need now is a new economic vision, a new economic game plan that is powerful enough, practical, can be implemented in less than 40 years, and can move us to a complete post-carbon era by mid-century. Nothing short of that will do. And we have to do it now because the window is narrowing every year. So we step back and we ask, how do the great economic revolutions in history occur? That'll give us a cue as to what we need to do. The great economic revolutions in history occur, I believe, when 2 things come together. First, we change the way we organize energy on the Earth, and we've done that many times, different energy regimes. When we create new energy regimes, they make possible more complex civilizations. When that happens, it requires a communication revolution agile enough to manage these new complex energy regimes. When energy revolutions converge with communication revolutions, they change economic history. They change temporal and spatial orientation. They change the way we set up our living environments. As the Germans say, they change Gestalt, and they change consciousness, fundamentally. Let me give you an example. Forager hunters. For 93% of our time on this planet, we foraged, we hunted. Mostly foraging, only occasional hunt. Forager hunters, the energy was, of course, their own bodies and being able to get the wild berries and the nuts and the fruits and occasional animal. Every one of the forager hunter societies in history created language to communicate in order to organize their economic and social life. Language, foraging and hunting, communication and energy gave rise to a change in the mind. We created mythological consciousness. Every single forager-hunter society in history, without exception, thought mythologically because it was based on their temporal spatial orientation of foraging and hunting within the periodicities of the planet. And interesting, when consciousness emerges, something else happens. We're now learning from our evolutionary biologists and our cognitive neuroscientists and our child development researchers that the Enlightenment philosophers got it wrong about human nature, what we really are all about. Back in the Enlightenment, John Locke, Adam Smith, René Descartes, the Marquis de Condorcet, they suggested that the church had it wrong about human nature. The church was pretty clear about it for 1,500 years. You're born in sin. That is our basic condition. Salvation waits in the next world with Christ in eternity. The Enlightenment philosophers said, no, little babies are born tabula rasa, John Locke would say. What you put into them, you get out of them, although John Locke had a little caveat. He said, except there is a biological predisposition to acquire property. Somebody should have caught him on this. Someone should have caught him. Adam Smith said, little babies are born to pursue their own individual self-interest in the market, and they seek to be autonomous agents in the world. Jeremy Bentham said little babies are born to seek pleasure over pain. We are a utilitarian creature. Rene Descartes said little babies are born to be rational, calculating, detached. Charles Darwin said little babies are born to seek their reproduction and survival, all species. And then Sigmund Freud capped it at the end of the 19th century saying, actually, little babies are born with an insatiable sexual appetite, and all of life is about extinguishing libido. How many parents and grandparents here? You raise your hand. Oh, God, you're all reproducing up here. Woo! Is that what the little baby is when that little baby comes out of the womb? Depraved, in sin, avaricious, aggressive, detached, rational, calculating, seeking their own pleasure-seeking, libido-driven, autonomous drives. It's amusing if it weren't so sad. And if that is who we are, we're likely doomed. I don't see any way that 6.8 billion people are going to come together in a global society living in one biosphere if we are either depraved, aggressive, violent, materialistic, utilitarian, pleasure-seeking, and autonomous-driven. Do you? That's embedded, that philosophy, in our schools, our business models, our whole society. But what the new discoveries are showing is that actually human beings aren't born that way. We're actually wired in our circuitry, soft-wired, to express empathy, because we're a social creature, to seek attachment and intimacy in larger communities. The primates, humans, many of the primates, we have wiring for mirror neurons, and the other mammals that nurse their young, that groom and play, they are soft-wired for empathic frame of reference, to belong. The worst thing you can do to a human is ostracize and isolate them. So the Enlightenment idea that autonomy is our goal, that's our punishment. So the reason I say this is as we move in different periods of consciousness, empathy changes. All forage or hunter societies, empathy only extended to blood ties. If there was another tribe on the next mountain, they were non-humans. In the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations beginning in Sumeria and Mesopotamia, they began to capture the sun's photosynthesis in cereal crops, and the stored barley and wheat and rye became stored energy. To create these great hydraulic agricultural civilizations based on concentrated irrigation, they had to indenture thousands of men and yoke them to build the canals. They had to create craft skills to run the dikes. They had to set up the royal granaries, the royal roads, the distribution systems, pretty complex, creating an energy regime on centralized agriculture. It required a communication revolution to manage it, and it was called cuneiform. And everywhere we see these great hydraulic agricultural civilizations, Middle East, Indus Valley of India, China, Mexico, and this is fascinating. Independently, humans come up with some writing system to manage it. That's amazing. And what happens to consciousness? It shifts from mythological to theological. All the great religions were formed back during the great hydraulic agricultural age. The Abrahamic religions, we are the people of the book because it's all about writing. Buddhism, script. And when we moved to these hydraulic civilizations, theological consciousness empathy switched again so that we could use it to create more social glue between people. And all of a sudden, people associate empathically with a new kind of family called the religion, which is not based on blood. Now every Jew sees every other Jew as a family member, a brother and sister, and empathizes, even though it's not based on blood ties. Christians in first generation Rome would call each other brothers and sisters, which was bizarre because that only meant blood ties up to then. But we extended empathy to create more social glue to integrate us into more complex civilizations. First Industrial Revolution, 19th century, another convergence of communication energy, changed consciousness. The print press became popularized in the 19th century because we introduced steam technology to print, linotype and rotary, so we could produce print really cheaply. Then we introduced public schools in North America and Europe between 1830 and 1880, and we created a print-literate workforce, communication, to manage the complexities of coal, steam, and rail. We could never have organized the first industrial revolution with codex. What happened to consciousness? The new temporal spatial orientation? We went from theological to ideological consciousness, sense and sensibility, the Enlightenment, the post-Enlightenment, the Romantic reaction. And when we went to ideological consciousness, empathy extended again to cover the new temporal spatial boundaries that were more inclusive. All of a sudden, there's a new family called national loyalty. Something called Canada. Canada is a myth. Germany, a myth. France, a myth. We created these new frames of reference, and now all Germans empathize with Germans as family, but maybe not with the Italians. The Italians empathize with Italians, but maybe not the French. You understand? And we extended empathy again in a broader way. In the 20th century, Second Industrial Revolution, the telephone, critical. New electricity communication became the management tool, cinema, radio, and TV, the marketing tools to organize oil, the internal combustion engine, the auto age. In fact, two great Canadian communication philosophers laid this out for us, Harold Innis and his student, Marshall McLuhan. And we extended consciousness from ideological to psychological consciousness. Everyone in this room, we think psychologically. Grandma couldn't. Grandma can't think therapeutically. She can't be introspective. She can be theological. She can be ideological. She can even be mythological. But Grandma can't get into herself and talk about how her feelings come from where and how it's expressed with us. She can't do it. And when we went to psychological consciousness, empathy extended again to people of like-minded associational ties. So here's my question. History's not linear. There have been many blowbacks, many downsides, many very bleak periods. But there is a jerky history here of new energy and communication revolutions, sometimes in various periods of history, bringing us forward with new types of consciousness, mythological, theological, ideological, psychological. And we have seen, although it certainly hasn't been neat, and there's been a lot of bad times, empathy extend from blood ties to religious association to national identity. So here's my question here in Canada. Is it possible to conceive a new energy communication revolution that could extend consciousness once again beyond blood ties, religious association, national ties? We don't give them up. We still associate by our nations and our religious affiliation and our blood ties, but could we extend another layer and begin to have consciousness that's biosphere consciousness? Actually attuned to the biosphere and empathic to our fellow human beings and our fellow creatures as a one extended family. Is it possible to conceive of that? And empathy extending to the rest of life on this planet. Why would we stop just at the nation state? So this is a hopeful sign to me. But there have been many periods in history where we have tried to move from one communication energy revolution to another. The new identities were so threatening or so ill-prepared that there was crisis, blowback, and hundreds and sometimes thousands of years before we got there. There is no guarantee. We are on the cusp of a third industrial revolution, a new convergence of communication and energy. I just don't know if we're going to get there in time. Depends on what time of day you ask me. More hopeful in the morning. We had a very powerful communication revolution in the last 15 years, the personal computer and the internet. This is very different than first-generation communication electricity. That was all centralized, top-down, telephone, cinema, radio, television. This new internet communication revolution, ICT revolution, is flat, open source, distributed, and collaborative. And that's the key word. I want you to take back to your urban design firms, your architectural firms, your engineering firms, your planning firms, your interior design firms, distributed and collaborative. Which means that now 2 or 3 billion people can take a BlackBerry in the palm of their hand and send their own video, audio, and text to everyone else at the same time, distributed with more power than the CBC, the BBC, and CNN put together. This distributed ICT internet revolution is just now, in the last 18 months, beginning to converge with the new energy regime, distributed energy. When distributed communication manages distributed energy, we have a powerful third industrial revolution that might get us to biosphere consciousness maybe in 2 generations. Maybe. What are distributed energies? Let me compare them to elite energies, which we're familiar with. Elite energies are elite because they're not found in your backyard. They're only found in a few places. Go home today, chances are you're not going to have oil, coal, natural gas, and uranium in the backyard. You may have tar sands if you're out in Alberta, but by and large, you're not going to have these fuels. They only exist in certain areas of the world. So right away, they require huge military investments to secure them. They require very intensive geopolitical management to control them and have access. And they require huge capital to organize them from the pit and the mine to your car. We have created the most centralized, top-down, patriarchal form of energy regime in history with fossil fuels and uranium. Those energies are sunsetting. Does anyone here believe that coal, oil, gas, and uranium are sunrise energies? Does anyone believe their price is going to continue to go down? They're going to go up, up, up. And the entropy bill is going to continue to go up, especially as we become more desperate and want to go to coal, tar sand, heavy oil. But we can't afford that because we're already in real-time climate change. That's not an option. It's not an option. So what are distributed energies? Those are energies that are found in every square inch of this planet, every single square inch. The sun shines across this world every day. The wind blows across this planet every day. There's heat under the ground, that geothermal core of heat. It's there everywhere there's ground. Where there's water, there's hydroelectricity. If we're in the rural areas, there's agricultural and forestry waste for energy. Everywhere we live, our garbage can be recycled through anaerobic digestion. If we live on the coast, which most of our urban populations do, we have the ocean tides and waves that come in and out every day. These are distributed energies because they're found in some proportion in every square inch of this world, ocean and land. More energy than our little species will ever need. The European Union has committed itself to a 5-pillar infrastructure for a third industrial revolution. I was privileged to develop this game plan for the EU over the last 8 years. It was endorsed by the Parliament in 2007. It's being implemented by the various agencies and departments of the Commission and in the member states. Unless we short the EU, let me remind all of us here in North America, we talk about G20, G8, G2. And oh, Europe, that's where we go for vacation, the museum. Please. The 27 member states of the European Union, which is a political union, the GDP exceeds the GDP of the 50 states of my United States Union. It is the lead economy in the world. And if right now you put America and China together, it's almost equal by the wealth of the member states of the EU. And if you include their associated partnership regions, it's serious. So we have a model. It's a 5-pillar infrastructure. I'd like to lay it out to you. We're just beginning. Pillar 1, the EU has committed itself to 20% renewable energy by 2020. That is a mandate, not a benchmark. Everybody's rushing to get there. That's a third of the electricity of Europe, renewable, 10 years. Pillar 1. Pillar 2, we began to ask ourselves in Brussels, how do we collect distributed renewable energy? Our first thought was, well, that's easy. Go where it is, in abundance. So Italy, Greece, the Mediterranean has all the sun. Grab it down there, centralize it, get a big, huge, high-power voltage grid and send it back to Europe. The Irish have the wind. Grab it, centralize it, high voltage grid, send it back to Europe. The Norwegians have the hydro, etc. Now, we do not oppose centralized renewables, solar and wind. We think they're essential during the transition, but they're not sufficient to the new next period of history. Essential, not sufficient. The question we began to ask, which seems so obviously simple now, is if renewable energies are distributed and they're found in every square inch of the world, why would we only be collecting them in a few central points? Architects, engineers, urban planners. We began to realize we were thinking 20th century. Centralized energies, go get them, and then send them out, top down. So pillar 2, we began to realize it's all about buildings. Buildings. The number 1 cause of climate change in the world is buildings. They use a third of the energy, a third of the CO2. Parenthetically, and I always have to mention this, the number 2 cause of climate change is not transport. That's 3. We spend a lot of time on buildings, 1. We spend a lot of time on transport, 3. Does anyone know what 2 is? It's beef production and consumption, and then related animal husbandry. And not one government leader in 194 countries has made a single statement on the number 2 cause of climate change. And even Al Gore, who's questioned on it for years, finally acknowledged it's an issue. And Barack Obama, who was elected as the internet president, who's into renewables, every Friday he has a hamburger lunch at his favorite hamburger place with heads of state for a photo opportunity. Now, if he were to drive there in a Hummer, you would be upset. Either he doesn't get it, or he does. Either way, that's not a good sign. But buildings. We have 191 million buildings in the European Union. Homes, offices, factories, shopping malls, rural and urban infrastructure. What we envision is reconfiguring every single existing building to a partial power plant. Grab the sun on the roof, and through photovoltaics on the walls, the windows, the glass, the shutters, and the entire construction material. Grab the wind up the wall with vertical wind. Grab the heat under the ground. Grab the garbage for recycling. Grab the rural waste. Grab the ocean tides. The buildings become the collection points for the distributed renewable energies in each node of the world. The new buildings will be positive power. But the reason we have to worry about the existing buildings is 70% of them are going to be here by 2030. The new buildings, we've got them up now in Spain. Acciona, the great construction company, has a zero-emission office building in Spain, in Navarro. Bouygues, the great French construction company, the second largest in the world. Olivier Bouygues sat me down 2 years ago and he showed me the office complex. It's gone up now. It's in the Paris suburbs. It's drop-dead gorgeous. It's architecturally just into the stratosphere, and it collects more energy than it needs. Just with the sun, it can send it back to the grid. The payback for the Acciona building, less than 9 years and no scale-up. That means we can get to 4 to 5 years with scale-up. Yeah, I know, it's ridiculous. Once you get there, the power's free. What we imagine is a construction boom across the EU. Millions of jobs over 40 years to completely reconfigure the urban and suburban real estate so the buildings have 2 purposes. They're a dwelling and they're a power plant. Think mainframe computer, desktop. Let me say that when communication energy revolutions come together, one of the things they change is the way we dwell, our habitats. All forage or hunter societies had to have nomadic habitats to move with the migratory rhythms of the foraging and hunting. When we went to hydraulic agriculture, we created the first small urban settlements. When we went to the first industrial revolution with coal, it allowed us to take stored sun and build huge vertical cities, starting with London and New York, with millions of people in them. When we went to the second industrial revolution, it allowed us a certain amount of distributed power so that we could move to suburban rollout and the ranch-style homes and the shopping malls. Third industrial revolution, the architectural reprint, the buildings are power plants. Then how do we connect them to create an energy communication revolution? That is coming. Pillar 3, 1, renewable energy. 2, buildings become the power plants. 3, we faced an interesting problem in 2003. Romano Prodi was president of the European Commission at that point, the former Italian prime minister. I was advising him, and we sat down one day. I don't know why I'm smiling about it, but I see his face right now. I said, Romano, we got a little problem here, because if we're going to go to 20% renewable energy in Europe, that's a third of the electricity. Can I paint a little picture to you? It's the year 2020, and a third of our electricity is renewable across 27 states from Ireland to Russia. And guess what? Hot summer, cloud covered 3 weeks across Europe, no sun. Really bad luck, the wind decides to stop blowing across Europe at the same time. Super bad luck, the water tables are down because of climate change, no hydro. And I said, Romano, what do we do? And he's a great man, very understated, not real mediagenic. He simply looked at me and he said, that's interesting. Now, usually when politicians say that, it means they ain't going to do a damn thing about it. When Mr. Prodi says it, something's going to happen. 2 months later, he had a €2 billion hydrogen R&D for hydrogen storage. Now, under Manuel Barroso's leadership of the European Commission, we've introduced 8 billion rollout for hydrogen. I'm for all storage, water pumping, for flywheels, capacitors, batteries. Hydrogen, however, gives us something universal. And this is important in Canada because you are a major producer of hydrogen and you have all the electrolyzers. You are the inventors of the electrolyzer technology. It's all here, just not taking advantage of it. When the sun shines on your roof, you get a little electricity. If you have some surplus you're not needing, you just put that electricity into water, like in high school chemistry, and the hydrogen comes out. You slept through this class, you don't have a clue. You have no clue. You're like me. You're in the humanities. You like literature, right? So the hydrogen comes bubbling out. You put it in a tank. When the sun's not on your roof, you convert the hydrogen back to electricity. Don't come up to me afterwards and say, isn't that an energy loss? Yes. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Whenever you convert energy, you lose energy. When a predator eats a prey, only 10% of the energy goes into the predator. The rest is heat loss. If we took a look at all the energy loss in bringing nuclear to you and me and coal and oil, it's through the roof compared to this little process. So number one, renewable energies, 20%. Two, the whole building stock of Europe's converted to power plants. Number three, we put in hydrogen and other storage to make sure that we have a supply of energy when the sun's not out or the wind isn't blowing. Then pillar four. This is where the communication revolution converges with the energy revolution. We take internet technology, identical. We take the power grid and transmission lines of all of Europe and transform them to an intergrid that acts exactly like the internet. So when millions and millions and millions of buildings are collecting energy and just have a little surplus they don't need at any given time, the software can say, send it back across Europe and share it with your neighbors. This ability to bring distributed ICT to distributed energy is enormous. The music companies did not understand file sharing in music. They called it cheating. The music companies tumbled in 5 years with file sharing. Encyclopedia Britannica said, Wikipedia will never work. The open commons, distributed knowledge sharing on the commons, they're not laughing now. The newspapers did not see the blogosphere coming, distributed coverage across. And now they're converting to blogs, many of them. We're now talking about distributed collaborative energy. So that let's say, and everything's hooked up. It'll mean across Canada, every appliance will be hooked up to a distributed grid. Your washing machine, your thermostat, et cetera. So let's say here, let's say in Ontario, there's too much demand in the summer for energy and not enough supply, prices are going up. The grid can say to 150,000 or 500,000 washing machines, forget the second rinse. If you bought that program, you get a credit or a check from the utility company. It's voluntary. The grid will have dynamic pricing. We've already done these grids. They work. So you'll know the price of electricity day to day, and you're going to become obsessive compulsive once you find this out, what the price is. People say, oh, people don't care. Well, they tested this out, IBM and the government of the United States and Washington State, and a couple hundred homes put in the price of electricity during the day. People went berserk. So they said, oh my God, look at the price. Turn off that damn plasmid TV now. And they're running up and down the stairs all day long, turning on and turning off equipment. You won't have to do that because you can program the software. This is distributed capitalism, or we could call it dynamic cooperativism, socialism. It's a hybrid. It requires everyone being an entrepreneur, but collaborating in social spaces. It's a social market model, fits much better Canada than the US, because in 30 years coming up here, there's no doubt in my mind, with the exception of one part of this country, most of this country identifies more with the social market model of Europe than the pure deregulated market model in the US. I'm a fan of bringing them together and having one check the other. And what I say to my CEOs is, look, I've been at Wharton since the 1960s. I'm one of the oldest guys there. I believe in the market, but I also know its limits. The market's good for entrepreneurialism, for risk-taking, for personal responsibility, for creativity. It's dynamite. So I'm in favor of it. But if you leave it go and deregulate it and don't check it, it can lead to the winner-take-all and extremism. America was the most middle-class society in the world in 1960. Today, we're 29th out of 31 countries in income disparity. Only Turkey and Mexico have greater disparity of income because we deregulated and let it go wild. I believe in a social model to check the market so that we can make sure no one's left behind and we have a good quality of life. If we only have the social model, though, you end up with a Soviet system where daddy takes care of you from the government and we lose personal initiative. So every election in Europe, and mostly in Canada, is about how you balance social market, correct? It's the right way to go. That's why those are the countries that are going to move quickly on a third industrial revolution model, because it's both entrepreneurial, but it requires collaboration. It requires a dream that's based on quality of life more than just individual opportunity to be an island to oneself. Now, the fifth pillar. The fifth pillar is transport. Plug-in electric and hydrogen fuel cell transport. Plug-in cars are coming out next year, mass production. Daimler will have the first fuel cell cars out in 30 months from now. This is all a done deal. Watch the Germans. I advised the Chancellor. They've got all 5 pillars in place. Daimler, which created the internal combustion engine, they're going to have fuel cell cars out with stations across Germany in 3 years. That's why they've been the #1 exporting power in the world with only 80 million people. Right now they may be 2, but they're a powerhouse. They're in all 5 pillars. Pillar 5, plug-in electric. So you'll plug in your vehicle, whether it's a fleet vehicle or a home vehicle, with renewables, and then it's a storage plant. You can go back to the grid and connect up to get electricity, or if the price is right, sell it back. The utility companies have been seamlessly engaged with the energy companies for 100 years. That's starting to fall by the wayside because of transport. Now that electric plug-in and fuel cells coming out, and Andrew, you'll talk a little bit more about this, but now this is coming out, what's happening is the utility companies are beginning to set up power relationships with the transport companies to set in little power chargers all over the country so you can power in, meaning the utility companies are no longer as engaged with the energy companies. They're now engaged with transport and where we hook up for our energy, which is our buildings, construction, real estate. These are 5 pillars of a third industrial revolution. Renewable energies, converting the building stock of the world to power plants, setting up hydrogen and other storage technology for renewables, creating smart distributed smart grids that act like the internet, and plug-in transport for logistics. Here's my message to every architect, urban planner, designer in this room. This is a system. It works together as a living being. Unless we integrate all 5 pillars and put them down simultaneously, we lose the optimum possibility of each pillar. The reason we're not moving quick enough is we're piloting and siloing each little component of each pillar by itself as a little addenda in the wasteland. So yeah, your company will get a contract for a nice renewable building. Or maybe they'll do a little project for hydrogen storage or set something up. But unless we connect them with master plans that are collaborative in each community between business, government, and civil society, a plan that's collaborative and distributed involving every segment of society, laying these down at the same time, we're not going to make it. I chair this group that was mentioned at the beginning, the Global CEO Roundtable. In the last 12 months, we've tried this out. IBM's in our group, and Cisco, and Philips, and development teams like Arup and Gordon Gill, Adrian Smith, folks you know. We've done 4 plans. San Antonio, Texas, our 7th largest city, Monaco for Prince Albert, the city of Rome, and Utrecht. And we're realizing how difficult this is. This kind of cross-collaboration between regions and cities and companies to actually integrate these 5 pillars and set down a living system for an infrastructure. But that's what we got to do. Every city becomes a node. Now, I believe that this can lead to biosphere consciousness, because when every community is responsible for its part of the biosphere and has to steward the energy in its swath of the biosphere, but then it has to be a node to connect up laterally with other communities across continents that are responsible for their part of the biosphere and share energy across contiguous land masses, people will start to get the idea we're connected. That we are as connected in the energy flows of the planet, the sun, the wind, the heat under the ground, as we are connected on the social spaces on the internet. Connected. That's biosphere consciousness. Unless we think that this is an unattainable vision, go into any Toronto school system and they're teaching biosphere consciousness. They just don't know it, and it's a good thing because the school boards would probably take it out of most of the systems around the world. But go into the Toronto school system, they're teaching the kids that everything they do, the food they eat, the clothes they wear, the electricity they use, the family car they drive, has a footprint, an ecological carbon footprint that affects the well-being of some other family or some other creature somewhere else on the planet. That is biosphere consciousness. And as we pursue this idea of our interconnectivity by third industrial revolution infrastructure, so we share energy across this planet, we become aware that we are one species embedded with our fellow creatures in one indivisible community. And empathy expands. This communication revolution is an amazing vehicle for the extension of empathy, but it can also be dummied down and end up to be not worthwhile. When that earthquake hit Haiti, within an hour there were Twitters, and within 2 hours YouTube videos, and within 3 hours a whole generation was there in the backyard because this was an extension of us. When the Portuguese earthquake hit in the 1700s, no one knew about it for a year. You remember when that young pre-med student, you remember after the Iran elections, the students took to the streets because of the, quote, flawed elections? And one young man was videoing a pre-med student named Nadia, and she was gunned down right in front of the camera. Within an hour on Twitter and YouTube, on YouTube, every young person in the world had this, and within 2 hours, complete global solidarity of students. That's empathy extended. Finally, another example that hit me, remember when that video was taken of the polar bear? They caught a polar bear in August with her cub, and she was on an ice floe, surrounded by water, and they were not going to make it. Everyone saw that video, and immediately we empathized with that mother and the cub. They were us. We understood their plight, their desire to flourish and be, their struggle, and we said, this is us. That's an extension of empathy. Can we get there in time? When energy communication revolutions change, dwellings change and create the possibility of new interactions between people so that we become more social in a major way. How many of you looked in the mirror today? Why does everyone laugh when I ask? I mean, you've got to groom yourself. Well, look, I'm going to tell you something. Up until the 14th century, no one knew what they looked like. For all of history, no one knew what they looked. You could see yourself in a piece of metal, pretty vague. Water, still fairly vague. So grooming was not really too good, all right? But I want to show you how small technology changes with new energy communication revolutions change history. In the 1400s, we began to produce reflective mirrors in Murano off Venice. Then in the 15th and 16th century, the potash industry used a tremendous amount of wood for glass production and optics. And then we went to coal. Coal allowed us to produce glass very quickly, very cheaply. All of a sudden, people had mirrors and they could see themselves. It became a national pastime. Oh, there were no nations yet. It became a pastime. Oh, hey, wow, look at that. I'll be darned, that's me. That's you. That's me. This is interesting because for the first time, one sees how unique one's life is. I have a one and only history. I am very different than you. Every event in my life is unrepeatable. I'm fragile. Once I know I have a one and only history, I'm fragile, that I'm unique, it allows me to existentially identify with you because I look at you. You're so different than me. You have a one and only life. I can see it isn't the same as mine. So I become more introspective. I become more self-reflective. That's what mirrors do, self-reflect. It allowed us to create a greater sense of our individuality and a greater sense of our solidarity with every other individual human being who has a one and only shot on this planet and every other creature. Empathy is the ability to identify with another being's plight, their struggle to be and flourish against all the odds. And the compassion is our way of understanding how fragile this whole experiment's all about. It's solidarity. That's the glue for mammals, and especially for primates. So, when the Apollo mission took its last go-around on the dark side of the moon, our boys came out on the bright side, sun shining on the Earth. They shot a couple photos. We all put them up on the wall. There, this little teeny planet in living color, for the first time we saw it from the moon, we were blown away. Older generation. We put them on the walls, we put them on the cover of magazines. That was an out-of-body experience brought on with the new technologies. Today, every kid can do this all day long. If a child in a Toronto school system is Skyping in a classroom with a kid in Tokyo and gets to know them and gets their address, right after class, the Toronto kid goes up on the Google map, shoots down from outer space and looks at their whole neighborhood, where they shop, what they do for fun. So now we're so connected, we can look from the outside in, from the top down, from the inside out, And we begin to realize our embeddedness, the layers of embeddedness as we frame ourselves in one planet. Living in a biosphere means being attuned to the rhythms and the spatial orientation of that biosphere. So let me end with this industry in this room. It is all about how we resettle our living environments so that they reflect our responsibility for that small part of the biosphere in which we live. We're not ending urban life. We hit a milestone in 2007, half the human race is now urban. Big deal. By 2050, 75% of the human race. In the long run, we might get back to distributed patterns, but in the short run, how do we take this urban settlement, which is so detached and disconnected from the biosphere in a huge entropy sink? How do we reconnect our urban and suburban areas so that each one is responsible for its biosphere? So there's a biosphere Toronto, a biosphere Vancouver, a biosphere Calgary. In our Rome master plan, we reconceive Rome as a biosphere. It has 3 concentric circles: the inner circle, the historic core, which you travel to; the middle circle, the industrial commercial corridor; the outer circle, which you never see, is rural. It's 60–70% of Rome. So when we rethought Rome, we said, how do we make a biosphere in Rome in which the entire living arrangement reconnects so that it can be as self-sufficient as possible, but also be a node and connect with other biospheres to collaborate a more, what should we say, indivisible planetary relationship. So in the outer rim, we're putting in slow food agriculture, germplasm banks, we're nestling in energy parks. In the middle sector, zero and positive power buildings. In the historic core, we're keeping the facades, we're nettling out the insides and putting in the old Italian garden courtyards, all of it connected by foot, bicycle, in every way, so that Rome is a biosphere. And the architecture empathizes across all the lines. No inside, no outside, just a community. This is what you're doing here. There's a younger generation of planners and architects and engineers and interior designers. The mission is to reconfigure our living environments so they're empathic, and so that we bring the wild in and we bring ourselves out to the wild and we reconnect with each other and our fellow creatures and we bring life back to our planet. Last thoughts. This is not easy. I don't even know if we can do this, frankly. I know you want me to hear say, Spirit, we're going to do this. I don't know. I know we have the game plan. If this isn't the game plan, what's plan B? We know we have to get off fossil fuels and uranium. We know that the renewable energies are what bathes this earth. We know we have to collect them, that's the buildings. We know we have to store them, so that's storage like hydrogen. We know we have to distribute them, so we have to use intelligent technology. And we know we have to plug them in. This is not rocket science here. We have a game plan, but we got to create biosphere consciousness. We have to think as a species embedded with our fellow creatures, and that's the real mission and why I wrote The Empathic Civilization. Because if we don't have a change in consciousness, we will not have the reserve and the strength and the confidence to be able to get to a post-carbon era in time, because it is not about technology, it's about will. So I'm going to leave you with an anecdote. How many of you took your National Geographic DNA test? Pretty interesting, huh? So you send $100 to National Geographic. My wife and I and my in-laws did that. They send you back a biological kit. We take DNA out of our cheek, put it into the little tube, and send it back to the genetics lab. They analyzed our DNA, and they get us back results showing us, based on our genetic mutations, where we migrated from through history. All the way back, the map. It's amazing, right? Pretty interesting. What was more interesting, I'll save you all $100, is they tell us something else that I didn't know, but apparently 175,000 years ago, the Rift Valley of Africa, there were about 10,000 anatomically modern human beings walking those grasslands. The geneticist located one woman. She's a data baseline for genetics. They called her the mitochondrial DNA Eve, apparently fairly fertile because her genes passed everybody here tonight. It gets even more strange. We're not going to leave out the men here. About 70,000 years ago, Rift Valley of Africa, 10,000 human beings, anatomically modern. They located a guy. He's a data baseline. They call him the Y chromosome Adam, fairly potent guy, evidently. His genes passed everyone in this room. The other guys didn't make it. Yeah, the Bible got this one right. We all came from two people. We could have come from hundreds, but I guess the moral of this story is here we are, and we have different layers of consciousness in the world. Some people are still in tribal consciousness. We have theological. We have ideological. We have psychological. We have some in biosphere consciousness. We're dividing out by culture, religion, ethnicity, all sorts of weird things. And here we've come from common stock. We're a single species in all of our diversity, and we now have to reunite. We have to create global consciousness. We have to establish an empathic civilization. And the mission will start here in this room in Canada. It is going to be up to all of you folks here, the rest of us too, but in the architecture, in urban planning, in real estate, in engineering, in smart technologies. Rebuild our environments, reconfigure the way we live, allow us to live in environments so that we learn to be sustainable with the energy flows of the earth. Allow us to build environments that stretch a third industrial revolution infrastructure across continents so that we can drop the heat on the earth. Restore the planet for future generations. Give a chance for those not yet here, including our fellow creatures, to enjoy this mystery we don't understand called life. If we can begin this journey here in Canada with the industries represented in this room and move it across North America, maybe down on our part of North America, we'll listen to what you're having to say and we'll take your lead. I encourage you to join with the European Union and help make this a reality on this continent. We don't have another choice.
I just wondered if you think we can do this by ourselves or we have to have the government behind us.
Shoot, can we do it by ourselves or do we need the government behind us? The government is behind us. It should be. All the great infrastructure revolutions in history, communication, energy coming together to create living infrastructures, have been an affair that has to involve government, civil society, and business. The first industrial revolution was a joint venture. In my country, as in here, the government in my country ceded the public lands to the railroads. You had the transcontinental railroads here. We had to cede out new land for building new settlements, and where they set up the lines, new cities would emerge. We had to create coal storage across the countries. We had to set up the telegraph to monitor traffic on single rails. It all had to be done simultaneously. The second industrial revolution, same thing. It was one thing to have the automobile, but then we needed the roads. And we built the biggest set of roads in the world in the 1960s and 70s across Canada and the US. And then we had to have the pipelines. And then we had to have the communications to manage it. It had to be simultaneous. Then the suburban infrastructure rolled out from the interstates and the auto culture, the dwellings. So a third industrial revolution, I think, is a public-private partnership, but my belief is it'll start locally. It'll start in the cities and the regions. It is not going to start in Ottawa or Washington, because you have too many vested interests. Let me be very clear here. I want to be clear. And I work with the energy industry, and I have for a long time, but I got to be clear here. They have a tremendous lobbying ability, the old energy industry, but they're not the only show in town now. I'm here to say we've got a bigger group. That is, the construction industry is the elephant in the room, and IT, and transport, and power and utilities. So I think the energy industry has to understand they have to move with the times. I'm not saying we're going to be out of carbon anytime soon, but we're going to have to wean ourselves away as quickly as possible to a post-carbon era. It's going to require government and industry, both. And civil society has to buy in, or you're going to get a not in my backyard everywhere. People, for example, don't want power lines, correct? But if they know the power lines are their power lines and they're responsible for stewarding the environment and that they're part of nodes across the continent, you're going to get a very different reaction when it's theirs than if it's somebody else's, correct? So we got to do it together.
That's great. Okay, now we have a question from Nick from Vancouver. Nick asks, the only other person I have heard to be so open with such dire predictions is James Lovelock, proponent of the Gaia theory. Do you have any thoughts on his work?
I think the Gaia hypothesis was a real leap forward. The idea of biosphere actually was developed by Vernadsky, a Russian, at the first part of the 20th century. But what Lovelock and Margolis, the biologist, she's worked with them, they really developed the idea fairly extensively in the 1980s, the idea that the Earth actually does, the Earth acts as if it were a living system, as if. And that is the geochemical processes actually interact with the living processes to maintain a homeostatic, sustainable environment. We used to think the geochemical was just the background, and then life was plopped in it. Now we know that they completely relate to each other. So I think the Gaia hypothesis was good. I think now it's pretty recognized that our planet is a pattern of systems that interact with systems that maintain us in a state that we can maintain life on this little planet. It's interesting that we've come this far in 20 years.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Just wondering why there isn't a pillar for conservation.
I'm glad you raised that, because in all of our master plans, that's what we begin with, is energy efficiency. Not so much, I'll get to conservation, but we can't do these 5 pillars until we've gotten the efficiencies of the old fossil fuels really better. Because to introduce the 5 pillars, we've first got to deal with the old energy system. And so in Europe, we have what we call 20-20-20 by 2020. 20% reduction in global warming gases by 2020 based on 1990 levels. No fudging. See, Obama said we're going to drop 17% global warming gases, but that was based, I think, on 2005 levels, which would amount to like a 3% drop. All right? The second 20 is 20% increase in energy efficiency. The third is 20% renewables, which gets us to the 5 pillars. The 5 pillars is about conservation. Because and the reason we embed our master plans into biosphere, the biosphere is our home. So when these 5 pillars are designed to integrate a biosphere, so there is a partnership and relationship between all living beings, plants, animals, and humans. So if you look at our Rome biosphere, and these are open sourced, you can go web them up with us, all right? And look at what we've done there with the local authorities and local groups, is we've rethought Rome to bring life to the biosphere. And one of the things urban planning has to do is to start bringing the wild in and not keeping it out. We have to create these synergistic partnerships that work. That's a whole new way of thinking about life. Our kids are so divorced from life, they don't have any understanding of their fellow creatures. If we're simply in front of that simulated computer screen every day, we're going to lose the awe of nature. And I think we're already there, because our kids, the biggest word our kids use is awesome. Every time there's a sentence, a kid, is that in Canada? Awesome, awesome, awesome. Why are they doing that? Because they don't feel awe anymore. If you're in a little screen, your world can become big, but it can also be very small, because we lose the connection with the mystery of life on this earth. It's great to see a geographic film of the whales, but that's not the same as being there with them. So what we have to do is a Talmudic Aristotelian balance between how much time in cyberspace and how much time in the environment. It's another story. But for biosphere consciousness, we're going to change education. We're going to have experiential learning out in the communities, service learning. We're going to be able to bring young people out into natural environments to learn their biology or to learn their social sciences. We're going to have Skyping across classrooms in the world. We're going to have systems thinking, so kids can begin to understand that knowledge is something that exists between people. We share it. We don't control it. We have a high school next to my office building. You know what it says in the high school for all the kids coming back in the fall? Knowledge is power, Francis Bacon. What are we teaching these kids? Knowledge should allow us to understand our relationship with the life force of this earth. And then our kids will stop saying awesome. They'll understand the awe and feel it in a much deeper sense. They won't have to trivialize it.
That's great. Okay, so we have time for one more question, and it comes from Techneon's Ottawa showroom. Very interesting question here, Jeremy. When you start depending so heavily on batteries, do you not centralize the energy sources? Example, lithium for batteries.
We rely on batteries?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I must say I'm a fan of going to hydrogen. We're going to try the batteries. We've got a lot of different opinions. One of the guys on our team is Byron McCormick, who up until last year was the head of all future car development for GM. Did the electric cars, the hydrogen cars. At this point, batteries for storage, yes. Batteries for cars, let's give it a try. My belief is we're going to head to the fuel cell car, and Daimler's got it right. The batteries can't take the load on the recharge, and the lithium is very difficult to extract. I don't say no to batteries. I'm saying we try that, but if I were to make my bets, I don't say no to it. I think we're going to head to fuel cells because they're modular. They can take any kind of load for both storage and transport, and they don't have as many problems. But we'll see. We have to try several things at the same time here.
Round of applause for Mr. Rifkin. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.